It's very fitting because the Deputy Secretary General was suggesting, and Marcos did the same, that was in 2016 at the World Government Summit where we sat down, and I can't believe it was that recently that we had quite a robust debate as how do we capture the information to be able to measure the progress of the SDGs. If we look at different countries around the world, are we comparing data like for like? You remember the debate that we had, and people were saying, I'm not sure if I'm able to capture and compare. So the collaboration between the WGS and the OECD has proven in a short period of time, we're at least using the same measurements or yardsticks to say, how are we getting from here to 2030? Now, we have 3 country examples today. It's excellent because they have a common thread, if you will. It's Lebanon, Spain, and Argentina, which I think is fascinating because they're all dealing with their own economic challenges today. So if you have your own economic and budgetary challenges, how do you get from here to 2030 and say, I did the best thing I could do to get us to those goals? It's an absolutely critical question. And as the emerging markets editor for CNN, I don't think we can overlook the fact that we're 10 years into an economic cycle. It's been stretched because of some of the economic policies we've seen from the United States and other countries around the world with monetary stimulus, but we can't think that this is going to continue unabated, if you will, to 2030. There will be economic challenges, and we have to say, how important are the SDGs, and how do we fit an overall strategy in the road going forward? It's great to see our Minister of Environment here, Minister of Happiness here, and I saw our Minister of AI also. I think it goes to show us how the different ministries here, with very young leaders, are making sure this stays at the forefront of the agenda here in the UAE. So I congratulate you on that. Let's bring up, and we can give a round of applause at the end to our 3 panelists. First off, Ghassan Hasbani, Deputy Prime Minister of Lebanon. He'll be sitting right next to me in the center here. Her Excellency Cristina Galac, High Commissioner for the 2030 Agenda of Spain. Welcome. And probably our third panelist, who has one of the longest flights coming from Argentina and landed this morning, but he looks very energetic because we were having a chance to chat on the sidelines, Dr. Alberto Gauland from Argentina. I said that with confidence, Dr. Alberto. He had a hard time finding his chair, which is not a great sign. Are you okay after that long flight? It's good to have you all. I just wanted to forewarn, and I did talk to our technical folks. I want to make sure we have the microphones ready for the last 15 minutes so we can take some questions from the floor. Again, we had a very robust discussion even last year at the WGS, and I want this to be as interactive as possible. If I can, I'd like to start with Her Excellency Cristina Galac. We had a conversation beforehand, and what I was saying about the common thread is economic challenges in Lebanon with the refugees coming in from Syria, more than 1.5 million, at least officially 1.5 million. Argentina, under the Macri government, making a transition here from a less state-driven economy to one that's going to be more private sector-driven. But in that transition, there's been layoffs in the state, private sector layoffs because of growth challenges, and we know the IMF is at your doorstep helping you restructure to get through this transition. And in Spain, it went through its challenges over the last 5 years. But I wanted to start on this idea that SDGs, Cristina, can be used as a driver for growth as opposed to a sidebar commitment to meet credentials for the future. Are the SDGs at the center of your economic policy today, environmental policy, and how do they dovetail between the federal government and the local government? But are they at the heart of policy today as you draft your budget?
Thank you, Jean, for the question. And of course, can I just very, very briefly thank the organizers for inviting us. Being able to showcase positively our experience is definitely for us very important, and hopefully we can learn from each other even more. Yes, the Sustainable Development Agenda, the 2030 Agenda, the 17 SDGs are at the center of Spanish economic, social and environmental policies. In fact, it is a commitment of the Prime Minister, who himself expressed it in front of the GA Assembly last September, that this is a state policy. And we, because you, as you mentioned, have a very decentralized country, we struggle, and hopefully with success, to work very closely with the regions, but also with the municipalities. There is definitely an immense role that cities are playing on SDG implementation. So the governmental structures, central, regional, local, very, very important. Let me also mention that Spain came off quite successfully from the EU economic crisis, but with a major issue, which is that we left a lot of people behind. The internal inequalities grew, and the possibility of embracing SDGs and the 2030 Agenda as a process of bringing back equality and inclusiveness for us is critical. And my last point is that we are hardly hit by climate change. We have a country that is half wet, half very dry, and we have to go decisively through an ecological transition. And SDGs are helping us a lot. So economic, political, and environmental, in the three areas, we use the SDGs as an internal mobilizing tool and also as policy action.
A very quick follow-up, if I may, and then I'll bring in the Deputy Prime Minister from Lebanon. Prime Minister Sanchez came as a city councillor in Madrid. So does that give a greater understanding that he is a grassroots city person that understands the need to make sure these reach down to the people? They understand the mandate coming from the federal government, if you will, and even dealing with autonomous regions in Spain. It's a challenge, but does it help that he has a city backdrop?
Absolutely. Not only that, I would say the fact that we, and he himself, has a very deep understanding of the need to mobilize civil society, not just the administration, not just the economic sector, which is absolutely necessary, private sector, also the mobilization of the universities, the mobilization of social groups, the third sector, which has been extremely active in supporting those that have been more left behind. So this global and comprehensive view for us is fundamental. And if I may add, as profound Europeans, Spain is very actively involved in the European Union structures and institutions. As the audience know, we have a EU system that gives a lot of prerogatives to the European bodies. So we are at this very moment very much engaged, so as the EU institutions do also embrace the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda as the embracing arch for action.
Okay, I want to circle back later with you about the role of Spain in the European Union. I think it'd be interesting, Deputy Prime Minister Hasbani, because I've known you and interviewed you when you were in the private sector, and one wouldn't think of Lebanon when you automatically deal with the SDGs because of the other challenges at your doorstep. One is Syria, one has been finding a stable government. But since the placing of President Aoun, it seems to have been a turning point in terms of stability and the ability of Prime Minister Hariri to appoint people even from the private sector to say that this has to be at the core of our policies, not a fringe effort. Is it for real, or is it good on the writing and the outline of your objectives, but not in place on the ground in Lebanon?
Well, as you rightly said, we're facing unusual circumstances. The highest per capita refugee population or displaced people population, we have it in Lebanon, more than 40% of the population, posing a major burden on infrastructure, on society, on finances, and the entire structure. So in this backdrop, we started to view SDGs not as an additional activity to looking after the basic needs of the government and the country, but as a necessary activity to do so. So we are putting SDGs now at the heart of the planning process and the recovery process. We have a couple of major initiatives taking place right now with the formation of the new government last week. We're waiting for the vote of confidence on Tuesday and Wednesday in Parliament, so we're in transition now. But in this backdrop, what we're trying to achieve now is run a process related to a conference that took place in Paris, which called for a large amount of investments in Lebanon and financial support, which was effectively pledged over $11 billion, with a list of interconnected infrastructure and development projects. But if we were to deploy that without actually applying the SDG framework, we would probably lose the S from the DG. And that's a very dangerous thing when you are reconstructing a country and rebuilding an economy. With the budget priorities that we have, with the infrastructure investment priorities that we have, we found that SDGs are the best way of coordinating all activities. So we have engaged, and we started last year in 2018. We presented our first VNR at the United Nations. We made sure that it is an all-hands-on-deck approach. So it's not the whole of government approach alone, it's also the whole of society, the whole of the country approach. We had NGOs involved, all the top NGOs were involved with us, all the associations from the private sector, as well as all related departments in government at different levels, down to the operating level. Due to the large number of people, we've divided up the task into subgroups and thematic groups following the 5 Ps. Effectively, we've had 4 groups following the 4 Ps because the one related to coordination was cutting across all of them. And we managed to get a first scan of what we have towards the 2030 goals. And now we're kind of matching them with the investment priorities, with the fiscal and financial priorities of the government, so that we use SDGs as a framework of recovery rather than a kind of nice-to-have side activity.
Okay, very good. We can go from pledges to reality, and I've seen this in the past,
Yep.
right? Do you find that the money will be there? It's the reality check, because everybody says, oh, it's a stable Lebanon is so important for the broader Middle East and North Africa. Will the pledges be there in your view from what we've seen on the table?
Sure. Look, there's always a challenge translating pledges into reality, and the key thing to doing that is transparency and efficiency in deploying projects and plans. Projects are nice and good on paper, but if they're not done through an inclusive process and they're not implemented through a transparent process and coordinated with the donors and the investors, it's very difficult to achieve the entire pledge. So what we're doing now is, first of all, those projects and plans were presented in the Paris conference, the SED conference, based on a bottom-up approach. So I led the national committee that met with 1,200 municipalities across the country, and we scanned the entire base of requirements.
Wow.
We put them together, and for the first time in the history of Lebanon, we've had actually a complete blueprint of what is exactly needed at what level, what are the priorities. We linked them up together, presented there, and this helped in getting the pledges. Now, the challenge on us is to continue with the National Committee on SDGs, which I'm leading with the patronage of the Prime Minister himself. Continue also with the special committee required by the investor community that will oversee the deployment of the financial support and the investments. Most of them are loans and subsidized loans, but some of them are investments as well, in coordination with the countries who are pledging as well. So to create a high level, at the national level, at the most senior level, high level of transparency. So the chances of getting that, on top of this, we have the SDGs National Committee. We've established, again, at the highest national leadership level, a national committee for SDGs I'm leading its operations and coordination as Deputy Prime Minister. So all these three committees together will be working, continue to work to make sure that these pledges are actually translated into sustainable development programs. And that's the most important part, the stress on sustainable. As you said, we've had it before. We've had the investments before. Have they been sustainable? Maybe not all of them. And as a result, some of the past pledges did not make it to reality because we could not deploy the investments and the finances appropriately in the past. So we're avoiding that this time around, and SDGs have come as a great help to do that.
Good. Before I bring in Dr. Gowland, coming from the private sector to quite a nasty structure that can be very challenging at Lebanon, you kind of ever scratch your head and say, what did I do?
Every day, yeah. But it's fun. It's good to be able to translate some of the private sector know-how into public sector execution. It's very frustrating, no doubt, because the public sector operates at a totally different pace in totally different structures. But nevertheless, any achievement that can be done from that translation of experience and skills can make a massive difference at public level.
Okay, very good. The Deputy Prime Minister, Dr. Alberto, was talking about transparency. There's a very unique program, and I think it's worth starting in. The level of transparency when it comes to the Argentinian government on putting the portal together that unifies government, to Christina's point, the private sector, and then civil society through RACI, is it? RACI. But it's for everybody to take a peek and say, okay, this is the SDG progress that we've made to date, and this is where we're going. Is that level of transparency helping in a country that's going through such a painful economic transition?
Yes, there is a painful economical transition and also an integrity transition. Today in Argentina is a lot of private sectors being judged and also functionaries. So there is a great focus put in integrity and transparency. About SDGs, what they do, the government, they match the objectives to the planification of the government, but the innovation thing that we are doing, and I'm as the head of the government agency of the internal control, is to put the internal control behind the consecution of the SDGs. So we are not only, when the definition of the government takes that we are the government have to have the SDGs, we as internal control go after the different ministries and see if they are following and accomplish the object.
So that's the role of the internal auditor then. It's to actually put heat on if they're backsliding. Is that what you're, so you don't have to be so close to the microphone, don't you?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's also an innovation that I brought in the CIGEN because this is a focus of prevent. And the CIGEN can do, the internal control can do that, and we make the committees of control the mandatory two committees per year for every minister, and these committees, the agenda is all the impacts of the government, and also we are putting there the SDGs. So in the guidelines, in the planification for this year, they are put in there, and all the internal auditors of all the governments and also in the SOEs, they have to see if they are doing well with the SDGs.
Good. In my opening remarks, I was talking about the painful transition that Argentina is going through now, and I think Christina can address this in the Spanish transition, which was 5 years ago afterwards. But I think we saw 120,000 jobs from the private sector kind of shed during this very painful downturn in the restructuring of President Macri, at least 12,000 jobs from government as he tries to reduce the scale of the state. So poverty levels are probably rising during this period of transition. So how do you try to adapt your budgets to make sure that the widening gap between the rich and the poor doesn't get worse, that the climate change agenda doesn't slide off because of budgetary constraints? What is the challenge at home?
Well, Argentina have a great challenge this year to make the economy right, no? And it's a lot of years of popular politics and a lot of cost. And this year, the states, the structure of the state governments, they try to make less, but we have a lot of inflation problems and changes problems. So we are doing the best to equilibrate the economy this year, and the other year I think we are going to be best for seeing other projects and
Okay, very good.
how is much the
As I was thinking in the comparison of roles, Dr. Gallen to Christina, you're almost like the SDG czar of Spain, right? Because you have to sit above and say, what are the different ministries doing? How would you cooperate, for example, with the Ministry of Equalization and even the Ministry of Equality? By the way, 11 of 17 cabinet members are women, yeah? So how do you collaborate with these other cabinet members and suggest this is at the forefront of our policy? How does it work in reality?
Well, I think the best way to ensure collaboration is to have a very strong leadership from the top. So from the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister himself, there comes a very, very strong message of this is our driving force and our scheme, so we all have to work on. And in a more practical way, what we do is we work with all the ministries. We have focal points with whom we meet very, very regularly to ensure that the major actions that they are taking, from laws to be presented, from specific decisions to be taken, are coordinated. The system is very young because, in fact, we started the High Commissioner's office only 8 months ago, and we are entering the first budget cycle, which is, in fact, in front of the Cortes, which is our parliament right now, with a very strong sense of SDGs. We did a presentation very recently to the Parliament on looking at the budget through SDG lenses. So looking at the different chapters, which were the amounts that were going to be directly affecting equality, climate change, consumption, etc. And we ended up with already a specific figure. So the budgeting is, I would say, in a process of aligning the budget to the SDGs, but ideally this has to go to a second phase, which is the one of localizing, looking at where are the gaps, and how do we budget to ensure that we face and we address those gaps. I would say this is a later stage. But definitely coordination is critical, and we are aware that we will find situations, we will encounter moments in which coherence would be would have to be addressed. I think that key leadership is very important, and knowing the priorities, which is equality, which is ecological transition, which is ensuring that we don't leave people behind, but at the same time that we drive the economy to the new sectors.
Okay, let me interrupt you there because I want to do this in a kind of a very direct way to give a scorecard here, because we're looking at the positive progress to the SDGs. So I want to start with that, and then I want to say, where are we deficient? Because I don't want to wake up in 2030 and say, we had 17 goals, and, we hit 3 of them in my country, or I hit 5. So I think we need a reality check. So I'm going to ask for the 2 positive things you think are happening in each one of your governments now with regards to SDG. DPM?
Well, the most positive thing is the collaborative effort that's happening across ministries, departments, as well as civil society and the private sector. So it's a very big collaborative approach. The second thing is the speed at which SDGs are fitting in place, because they've already reached a degree of acceptance across the board, and they're starting to help people organize themselves, because different ministries were acting in silos and they were not sure what to prioritize in terms of programs and projects and what kind of goals to have. It's helping the government at all levels form a vision and a view towards the future and work against specific targets. So organization-wise, it's good.
Okay. Dr. Gallen, what's the case in Argentina? The 2 most prominent successes or big hits that you've had so far?
I think that is a new law of woods that could be a good one to.
What's that again? Sorry.
Of woods.
Uh-huh.
But as I said, the best thing we are doing is to control the accomplish of this and not be on 2030 and said how many.
Yes.
So that's my.
So it's a constant measurement is what you're suggesting, I think, right? Is that correct?
Yes, because, and I just suggest to empower internal audit to do that, because they are strategically positioned. They carry very good professionals and know very well where the strengths and the weakness of the of the government, and also we can monitor and guide the authorities to do what we want to do with the SDG.
Pretty flexible governments. I mean, from all 3 of you, that's the flexibility and the focus, I think, with having the right framework works. Christina, what would you say are the 2 wins for Spain in this?
I would say we have been able to put together an agenda for change, which in fact was presented and adopted yesterday by the government. And the view there is to ensure that we address the major challenges from an SDG perspective, which is based on coordination, in particular of key ministries. And I would say the second most important thing we have been able to do is to mobilize private sector and civil society, and to bring a sustainability perspective to each and every one. And what does it mean? We need companies, public, but also in particular private companies, that embed the sustainability in their boards, in their actions. And we need the civil society, we need NGOs, universities, we need this mass amount of individuals that are organized in different groups that also champion sustainability. So working in the administration to provide the right frameworks, but I would say as well, mobilizing across the board each one that is in a leading position, in particularly able to transform.
Okay, I'm going to come back with the biggest challenges now, but I want to can we turn the lights on and make sure we have microphones? Do you mind if I call on you, Dr. Mohadeen? If I can get a microphone to the front row with Dr. Mohadeen, because you were here with us 3 years ago when we had this spell check, so we can bring one here. Is there another question that's prepared from the floor? We'll get a microphone into your hands, but I'll come back to you in just a second. So, Deputy Prime Minister, the failures so far as you can see them, what's the reality check of what you're trying to do and the real challenge on the ground? For example, infrastructure is a huge challenge for you with the budget constraints you faced. What would you say?
So far, it's early days to tell. We still have, we've had good successes also on impact-wise in healthcare, for example, and education. They've done quite better than other sectors along the SDG goals, for example. Where we have failed is to address the environmental issues so far. They're taking longer than they should.
Why is that, do you think?
Political debates around them. So there's a major disagreement among political parties as well as civil society on environmental solutions. So we're trying to fight corruption there. We're trying to get the proper solutions in place. And this will take more than the SDG framework to achieve. So this is a big challenge for us on the environmental side and some of the infrastructure elements related to environment, particularly the wastewater management networks, etc. So those are two major challenges that we're calling upon the international community and the investor community to support Lebanon with, and this is part of the conference that we've had in Paris for development. So that's the thing. The other side is the struggle now is we're widening the definition of sustainability, because traditionally sustainability has always been related to environmental sustainability. Here we're actually addressing it from a bigger perspective. That's its investment sustainability and development sustainability.
That's excellent.
So those developments should also be sustainable and should have a life of their own, should be able to bring economic prosperity to the country and enable government to operate more freely and independently in the future with less support or financial support needed from outside the country. So to get this natural growth in the economy triggered through SDGs.
Good. It's also invite some of the talent back, I would imagine,
Yes,
like
exactly.
yourself, that decided to come back. Christina, what would you say are the biggest failures so far on this road on the SDGs?
If you allow me to say, because we are quite young as an office, I wouldn't call it yet failures,
Right.
but challenges.
Okay, good.
So I would say key challenge is going to be to ensure that the whole population knows what SDG is, with this sustainability as a whole, this very holistic view of sustainability and how much everyone can participate. So this is a key challenge. I would say leadership is very important. It's a challenge as well, because we need top leadership, we need, of course, governmental leadership, we need mayors, we need CEOs, we need teachers. So we are mobilizing so that everybody is absolutely embedded with this very holistic view of sustainability. And then let me mention another key challenge is giving the right figures and being absolutely transparent. And by that, we are working with our National Institute, the Statistical Institute, to ensure that we can regularly give data so that we know the impact of the decisions. Again, starting, we already are putting out very clear data on 40, I would say even more of the key benchmarks that the UN has.
40.
Now 40,
Wow.
we hope to have about 100. So all this progressively will be able to translate to the citizens' progress or lack of progress, and then decision and action.
Because government in a very different way of thinking than we would have
Yeah.
10 years ago, right? Because the
Absolutely.
KPIs are all out there for everybody to look at, which is good. So the other benefit of AI, right, and blockchain for the future in terms of implementation.
Yeah.
Dr. Gallen, the biggest two challenges that you find, Christina's having me change my language, not failures, but challenges.
I think that the corruption in the region of Latin America was very mean for the SDGs and everything now. So we are trying to get the page down, but that is a weakness in the region, and I think that we have to make a network in the region to go along with the SDGs. This year, we have in the Mercosur, we have 2 reunions per year. In May, I have in Argentina, and I make the SDGs as the title of the reunion, so to start to work along with it.
Such an amazing concept, such a beautiful continent, particularly a beautiful country, that doesn't put the SDGs and climate change right at the top of the agenda. It's a change of mindset, though, I think is what you're suggesting. Dr. Mohideen, how did you want to weigh in here? Because remember, we had this very fierce debate. How do we measure where we are? The measurements that I'm hearing are pretty robust today. What's the next challenge?
Thanks so much, John. And you said it's like yesterday, but it was more than 1,000 days ago when we launched this SDGs in action in the main stage with the DSG of the UN and the Minister of International Cooperation. So this reminds us of the fact that it's almost more than 20% gone of the period allocated to achieve the SDGs. And we have 4,000 days remaining. And if I were of the position of ministers responsible for the implementation, I would put a countdown clock somewhere to remind the people of the urgency of time. Issues here, I think, based on the best statistics available, there is a great deal of unevenness across the indicators, across the countries, and across the local authorities. So this may not really be very helpful. And I'm referring to one of the best regions in performance, which is East Asia and the Pacific. So if this is the case in East Asia, you would wonder what is happening in Latin America, in Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa.
Can we get your, to drill down a little bit, unevenness in poverty reduction or climate change?
We take it indicator by indicator. So there are some countries doing better than others. There are some regions doing better than others. And across the indicators, there are some improvement in some of these indicators, like in the poverty, but not necessarily in health, not necessarily in climate. And we can go on, and the list could be available outside. So this is the first thing that I'd like to share. The second one is basically about data. And I wish if the excellent recommendations coming out from the Dubai Forum that was hosted by our brother Nasser Saeed Dota, and he did an excellent job in doing that. But until this moment in 2019, we keep referring to 1 or 2 years old kind of data. This is not very helpful for governance, for policymakers to do their job. However, I'm very impressed with what have been shared so far. And I think the three ministers gave us 3 points of emphasis. The hope that SDGs can bring and the kind of collaboration and unity mentioned by Deputy Prime Minister Hasbani. I attended his excellent presentation last year at the UN. This issue of localization mentioned by Minister Galach, I think this is the difference between success and failure. If you are going to be localizing or not, but not just localization in implementation, just coming from the meeting with the Arab Monetary Fund and Madame Lagarde, it's issues about resources as well at the local level. How are you doing better in this front? And finally, how are we partnering with the private sector? And Buenos Aires was a very great host for the G20 last year to identify the role of the private sector in the implementation of the SDGs. So better data, better participation of the private sector and the rest of the stakeholders and the civil society, and indeed better implementation at the local level. Otherwise, we will be facing what we faced, and Madame Clark is here when we did the last 1,000 days of the MDGs. Whatever you are trying to do, and you mentioned that, John, at the beginning, if you are in 2028 today, will you be able to catch up what you should have been doing in 2019 or 2020 or not? Unfortunately, our experience, despite the fact that people woke up before the deadline of the MDGs in December 2015, it was very late in the game. With more modest targets to achieve and better global environment that we are facing today. So I think we need really to get all of these elements together. And again, to get this nice opportunity offered by Madame Lagarde, that she's going to be putting SDGs as part of the Article 4 agreement, which is very good for governments, so they can have good negotiations when it comes to budget and public debt management. The second thing, better identified role for the private sector, and I hope what was promised here in Dubai for better data could be available going forward.
Excellent. Really great input there. Do we have any other inputs from the floor before I bring this to the questions? Let's not be shy this morning. There's got to be some other. Please, a microphone here. Before you take the question, I just want to pose this to Deputy Prime Minister Ghasani. This is really, Hasbani, I combined your first name and your last name.
Quite quick.
Ghasbani, that's pretty clever. I always get called Jeff because of John Defterius, it gets translated, so I know the challenge. I brought this up in the beginning of my opening remarks. We're really late into an economic cycle.
Yeah.
So if we get a global shock, what happens to your SDG plan? Does it get blown up, or is it sustainable enough to withstand the shock of financing?
No, I think the framework is quite robust. As I've experienced it over the last year or so, it can withstand any changes and modifications that could happen to the economic cycle. In fact, it could help in triggering a positive economic cycle. I'm a firm believer that since we've been 10 years into a negative cycle, I still stand by my old predictions that between 2020 and between 2000 and 2030, we're going to end up with the highest GDP, global GDP growth, or annual global GDP growth, second highest since after the Second World War.
You think so?
Yeah, I still stand with that. We've had 10 years of downturn.
I'd love to know the elixir you're drinking right now.
No, but if
you think it's possible?
Between 2000 and 2008, we've had a good cycle.
Yes.
Then 2008 till now, we've had a kind of stagnation cycle. But I'm quite confident and optimistic that between 2020 and 2030, we will get a rebound in one way or another. Things that will help this rebound are the third industrial revolution that's emerging, things related to SDGs and this global collaboration that's happening at UN level and various multi-stakeholder levels. I see positivity taking place. I see a new approach to handling government and public good activities. It's evolving very quickly. It will evolve at different paces around the world, not necessarily at the same pace, but the world is bound to create a system to recover, and SDGs are robust enough to be able to sustain any kind of shifts along that line. But the biggest challenge remains data, and I totally agree. I also presented the ESQA report at the UN in the last meeting, because Lebanon was chairing the session, the ESQA session in that year. And we've had that challenge across the Middle East region as well. Data is not complete, and it tends to be outdated most of the time, so we need to work on that.
Yeah, it's amazing, though, because if you roll back the clock 10 years, even the Middle East, North Africa, the data input was pretty weak. It's improved a great deal. We have a great opportunity with the technology that's there today to change it. A familiar face, but I forget your name, sir. Go ahead, it'll come up, just, that's fine. It's yep.
Hi, John. This is Professor Munir Kosu. We had this chat last year. Yeah, good to see you again.
Thank you.
I'm surprised one of the very key things that was not mentioned at all, technology, innovation, fourth industrial revolution. We are living in a time where funds are shrinking, there is rising populism, it's highly unlikely funds available could get bigger, they're going to shrink. Even by today's standard, the World Bank Vice President is here, they are facing a shortfall of 2.5 trillion every year, and it's coming nowhere. And this is happening at a time when 3 billion people don't have access to internet, 2 billion people don't have mobile phone. So on one hand, we have smart cities, AIs, blockchain. On the other hand, you have this extreme poverty. So this digital divide is going to get worse. So I would like to know from three of you, since three of you are in different levels, what are your governments doing? Coming from the global south, I represent the think tank, Institute of Policy Advocacy Governance. That has been a key concern.
That's great.
How are you handling the digital divide? And equally, why it hasn't come out in the argument that you made? Because this is a very critical thing which will drive in the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being so direct. We have 2 minutes, so Christina, I'm going to ask you, each of you for 30 seconds. But this is an interesting point. We've had, for years, 1 billion people without access to reliable power. Well, that dropped below 1 billion, right? So, I mean, there's some indicators that show, as Dr. Mohideen was suggesting, some progress, and other indicators that suggest that poverty is getting worse. How do you address this in this revolution that we're facing?
If I take your comment, which is absolutely pertinent, for example, in our country, one of the areas in which we are lagging more behind is that for a number of years, due to the economic crisis, the funds for technology and investment in particularly research were totally cut. So this is a key hole. we want to ensure that at the European Union level, where there are more resources and where better organization and the scale economies can help, we have this vision of SDG approach. And that's why we are pressing very hard at this very moment that with the new European Union political cycle starting at the end of this year, we have a global approach 5 + 5 years, because we think that, in particular, in issues on research and development and implementation through better technologies are key. So the driving force is that. But definitely, it's a key fundamental point.
Okay, and the last point, which is directed or generated from the question, and we're out of time, so I'm going to ask the Deputy Prime Minister to finish with a 1-minute comment. I've read so much about this, and I've talked to so many different leaders. They say it's so hard to try to lead today because of the technology revolution and social media and the populism and people getting so angry so fast and not seeing a quick enough result, which is impossible from government. How do you deal with that on a day-to-day basis where expectations are high, the voices are heard now because of the level of collaboration on social media, and the realities you deal with within government to move only so fast?
Yeah, this is a nightmare. Governing in this day and age is a very difficult task because there's a lot of misleading information. And the digital divide actually is not so terrible when it comes to having basic communication tools available to people. Suddenly, you find the poorest level people and the most unprivileged people in society have access to smartphones and communication tools. Yet, what they don't have access to is where I find the digital divide is in this industrial revolution, is access to technology-driven services that improve quality of the service. So communication has become widespread, but we've realized that communication is not enough. In fact, it could be a negative thing at some time because it's full of misleading informations and populism, and then you start governing by remote control effectively, and this is the worst thing to fall into. One has to be detached from this. It's a good listening tool. It's a good data collection tool to understand what people are thinking of and where the pulse is. But to use technology, and I have a session tomorrow on healthcare and how healthcare technology can be used to improve access to technology and reduce the digital divide. But to me now, it's beyond digital divide related to communications. It's actually a digital divide related to technology-based services, and that's what we need to address.
We're a bit spoiled here in the UAE, which was Dubai-led on e-government services.
Yeah.
I've been living here for 8 years, and it's quite profound in terms of going through airports and getting your identity cards and the rest. Thanks a million for being so direct and so collaborative. I appreciate the input from the floor. Dr. Modine, always a pleasure to get a nice report card. I'm sure, Maya, we have a break, right? Am I correct, for coffee? And we'll see everybody right after the coffee break. Let's give a nice round of applause to our panelists as well.